Moving on from the medieval period, we're going to focus on this period of 1500 to 1750, and that's actually known as the early modern period. Specifically, we're going to look at the growth in crime. We're going to look at the reasons for the growth in crime, we'll look at the new crimes in specific detail, and we'll look at some of the religious changes during this period also. First of all, we need to focus on the historical context of 1500 to 1750 and the changes that happened during this time frame. It's essential that we understand them because they led to the new types of crime. So, first of all, we need to say that England remained an extremely religious country. So it still focused on Christianity. However, the relationship between Christianity and the monarchy and the government had grown. They had now become very, very close indeed, to such an extent that Henry VIII, he became known as Defender of the Faith. So that's really important to understand the strength of religious feeling during this period. In addition to that, London had grown as the biggest city in Europe, and it had grown because of its commercial and trading interests. People would come from all over Europe, and the government would actually make money from all of this trading. The king would make money because of taxes that were put on the goods that came into the country, and that will be important for us to understand when looking at new types of crime. In addition to that, we had some transport beginning to form. So there was some improvement in roads. So there was some, not dramatic differences from the medieval period, but there was some transport in the form of horse and carriage, and roads were beginning to form across the country. But ultimately, England was still agriculturally based. It was an agriculturally based society. All of these different factors are important for helping us to understand the historical context. I've just mentioned the importance of religion during this period, and religion became more intense. There was a new intensity around religion during this era. And there is a group that really highlights this, which became quite prevalent throughout the period, and they were known as the Puritans. Now, the Puritans had extreme views. Here, even the way they dressed was very basic. They lived their lives according to the teachings of the Bibles in a very strict sense. And as a result of the intensity around how strict and extreme their views were, they believed in the concept that there were moral crimes. So these moral crimes became official throughout this period, and they believed they should be punished and punished intensively also. So we've got drunkenness, swearing, sex outside marriage, and these moral crimes they believed should be punished. In addition to that, because of the intensity around religion in this period, there were strong beliefs in the devil. There were strong beliefs in dark magic and the dark forces of demons and the power of the devil. And this ran throughout the context and would actually affect the new types of crimes that would appear. Historians actually say that there was a dramatic increase in crime in the mid-16th century, and these revolved around three main factors. The first one revolves around an increase in population. In 1520 there were 2.4 million people, whereas in 1600 there was 4.1 million people. So essentially there were more workers, and as explored in the previous study around how workers could ask for higher wages because there were less of them after the Black Death, well, throughout this period there was actually falling wages because there were more workers. So wages actually went down, and when you add that with high food prices, you had some major social problems going on. And historians argue that it was these three factors of the increase in population, add that with the falling wages and high food prices, that led to an increase in crime because people felt as though they needed to steal more food in order to survive. So let's zoom in and look at the types of crime during the early modern period. And I want to emphasise the historical second order concept of continuity and change, because some things stayed the same, but some things changed. So what stayed the same during this period and what continued, the types of crimes that continued, they revolved around vagrancy and theft, murder, heresy, rape, etc. Those types of crimes continued. However, because of the historical context, because of the improvements in roads and the improvements around horse and carriage, what was a new type of crime was highway robbery. So here we can see a highway robber stealing things from people who would travel. Now remember, there weren't any banks back then, so often people travel with their valuables. So this was particularly attractive to the highway robbery gangs that existed during the period. In addition to that, I touched upon how London became a centre for trading and how goods came in with regards, and those goods were taxed by the government. Well, we had smugglers. Those people would smuggle goods into the country so that they didn't have to pay tax. We'll look at that in detail in a moment. And then in addition to that, we had witchcraft. Remember, around the religious intensity at this period, people were suspicious of the devil and witches. So in summary, some things stayed the same, but some things changed. Earlier on in the video, we talked about the religious intensity that existed around groups like the Puritans. And around this, there was a strong sense of religious intolerance. These groups would not affect any type of deviation around the teachings of Christianity. And such intensity led to a suspicion and a widespread belief in the devil and evil magic. And from that was a belief in witches. So often accusations of witchcraft often began as a quarrel between a rich villager and a poor elderly woman who may have made a nuisance of herself, maybe lived on her own, or maybe was becoming forgetful, or would shout and scream and things like that, and they would be accused of witchcraft. They would believe that the devil was somehow inside of them. And these witch trials spread throughout the period. Lots of these witchcraft trials occurred during the 1580s and 1590s and through the chaos of the English Civil War. However, as scientific understanding improved, witchcraft accusations went down, but witchcraft was a crime. Highway robbery was a period where organised gangs began to become known throughout the countryside of England. And the environment itself were very attractive for organised crime gangs and highway robbers because, of course, roads were poorly lit and people who travelled on them, they carried their valuables with them. Remember, there's no banks and there was no kind of credit cards, so people who travelled, they had money and they had valuables. This developed to brutal thugs. These crimes were brutal thugs where violence were committed, murders were also committed, and highway robbery was a major problem throughout this period. And finally, I wanted to focus on the new crime of smuggling. Now, I've touched upon this about London being a centre of commerce and trading, and the government, they put import duties on them, and they're government taxes, and they exist nowadays. So if a product is coming from China, then the government will put a tax on them, and this meant that the price of goods actually went up. Now, during this period, the goods like tobacco and alcohol, which came from other countries, they would put like a 30% tax on it, so the goods became more expensive. Therefore, smuggling gangs developed where they would sneak those goods into the country, and that was a new crime. And they were very profitable for ordinary people. So this would help organised gangs to make money because they could sell goods at cheaper value because the taxes hadn't been associated with them. So let's zoom in on pressing save and a summary of the key learning points. It's really important that at the beginning of the video we looked at the historical context. We looked how religion had become even more intense throughout the early modern period, and how we looked at London had become a centre of commerce and for trading, and how roads had developed. And it was the historical context, the new changes and developments, they affected new crimes. And we've zoomed in on highway robbery, smuggling and witchcraft. And that's what changed throughout this. We also looked at how crime dramatically increased throughout 1500 to 1750. And that was due to three main factors. Number one, higher population. Number 2, because there were more workers, wages went down. And number 3, there were higher food prices. This all led to more instances of theft. And the golden thread throughout this was the extreme Christian beliefs. We zoomed in on how the Puritans, how they affected so-called immoral crimes, and that were things around swearing and drunkenness. And so looking at these 3 main points is really important for helping us to understand what changed and what stayed the same throughout the early modern period.